Imagine walking into a village and seeing everyone unconscious, lying on the floor as if they were interrupted in the middle of their day. They're all breathing and no one has any signs of harm. There are immediate stakes and questions. It feels like something that would frame the beginning of a horror film. But this isn't a scary movie, it's the setup for a brief and fantastic action sequence. Frieren, which many wouldn't even consider an action show, has some of the best action scenes I've seen in the last couple years, but only occasionally does it actually go there. Despite, or maybe even because of that, Frieren has a whole nother level of dynamics it feels like it can sometimes tap into. Welcome to a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when you have to end a fight in just a couple seconds. Dynamics are all about context. Take for example the Statue of Liberty. It's big, right? But how big? Most images of it don't actually help much because they don't have anything set to scale. But when you place a couple people at its base, you can see just how large it is. Dynamics in a story are a lot less about how big or small any individual moment is, but more so the difference between the two. That's why when there are big moments in Frieren Beyond Journey's End, somehow they feel even bigger. Match that with the fact that Frieren is capable of consistently telling entire stories in just half an episode, and you get some really interesting scenes. This show is most commonly criticized for being slow because a lot of people come in expecting a battle shonen. However, in many ways, Frieren feels like a fantasy character-driven slice of life. Well, most of the time. Because Frieren pulls something off that I think most shows actually couldn't. Realism. I'd argue in most storytelling, realism does not make for a better story. Things absolutely need to feel realistic. But to do that, you just have to maintain the suspension of disbelief, and mostly that comes from having a consistent universe. In creating consistency, you can make something feel more realistic. But in actuality, most pursuits of realism result in a less entertaining story. In most circumstances, even for people living the most adventurous lives, their day-to-day will be very monotonous. There's this quote from some famous author that I can't seem to find that essentially argues that anything, no matter how glamorous it seems, is 80% monotony. Being a rock star requires endless hours practicing and working rehearsals. Even sold-out tours require hours of driving between the destinations. The process of being a professional musician is a lot of practice and time in studios. If a fantasy world wanted to emulate realism, being an adventurer would be a very monotonous process. A lot of time would be dedicated to travel or mundane tasks to earn a living, like loading pumpkins or cleaning a statue. And even the most exciting moments, like fighting a dragon, would be brief. I think in most cases, realism can get in the way of telling an entertaining story, but I don't believe that has to be innately true. If you can capture realism through a compelling and entertaining story, I think that makes something special. Frieren's a story about what being an adventurer in an era of peace would actually be like, focusing on the small moments as well as the large. But the thing about being a rock star is, you still get on stage in front of thousands of people. It takes a couple episodes before you really can appreciate just how big Frieren can be at times. The first time the audience is introduced to this is in the fight with Quall in the 3rd episode, but when it really sinks in is Stark's fight against the dragon in the 6th. By that 6th episode, a lot of norms have been established. Frieren isn't your normal battle shonen, let alone one at all, despite taking place in a fantasy world. Earlier I argued that dynamics have to do with context, focusing not just on the peak of a scene, but also the distance traveled throughout it. And in telling a slow and quiet story, you're given so much space. This leads to these hyper-climactic moments, and then the show spends almost no time there. Most high-stress, dangerous situations happen very quickly. And what makes this fight in Frieren so fun is the gimmick it's all built around. A monster capable of using a curse that causes everyone to fall asleep around it. But then one character, who's resistant to curses, is put in an incredibly hard situation and forced to make a leap of faith. In a story where most fights last less than a minute, the climax of this one only lasts seconds. Taking a standard of already very brief fight scenes and finding a way to condense it even more. There's a previous video I made analyzing fight scenes in anime. In an attempt to differentiate and capture each individual component of what can make a great fight scene, I came up with 6 criteria. I think this fight engages in all of them very well. The magic system is used to enhance the situation and interact with the characters and plot. There isn't much choreography, but the camera work is fantastic. Directing decisions and viewer experience are prioritized with sound design and music, and it's incredibly hype with these few seconds that have been built up across the beginning half of the episode coming together. But to me, the most interesting component is the way this fight interacts with the characters and story. Let's start first by understanding how this conflict is set up. A group of adventurers find themselves in a city where everyone is unconscious. We find out that this is the work of a curse, which is beyond human magic understanding. In Frieren, there are two primary magic systems. The first is treated a lot like a science, and it is understood, and the second is that beyond understanding, mostly consisting of magic coming from an external source, like the goddess or demons. These two distinctions, actually interesting enough, feel like the difference between a hard and soft magic system. And priests who wield the goddess's magic mostly get it from an innate ability, something referred to as the goddess's blessing. There are lots of moving parts that make this conflict really interesting, not just in the way it plays out, but also in the inference afterwards. The party's priest, Sign, is resistant to curses, so slowly as this conflict escalates, each party member starts to pass out, until it's just him and Frieren. And before the final fight, Frieren says,
"Say, Sign, wake me when the monster shows up."
She urges him not to fight this monster alone, before finally falling asleep. There are 3 ways Sign can interact with the curse. The first is doing a long, arduous ritual to dismiss it. The second is briefly dismissing it on one person for 5 seconds. And the third and final option is to kill the source of the curse. This episode sneaks in all this exposition like little chess pieces. So when the fight finally starts, you have the board laid out in front of you, before a couple final components are made clear. This monster that Sign is trying to defeat on his own is capable of deflecting magic, which could lead to big consequences if the wrong spell is sent its way, especially from a mage like Frieren, who is abundantly strong. This same ability to reflect is making Sign realize he might not be able to take it on by himself. So this is where the decisions start getting really interesting and all the previous context of the story and characters come into play. The first incredibly important component for setting this stage is our protagonist Frieren, an elf that's lived over 1,000 years, built around the duality of both her wisdom and experience and long-lasting youth. This story starts immediately following the triumph of her previous adventuring party in killing the Demon King and saving the world. Part of the reason this story isn't a battle shonen isn't just because of the quantity, but also the fact that stakes are constantly undermined. There's very rarely significant risk because Frieren is one of the strongest mages in the world. But slowly throughout the season, the stakes climb and more risk is introduced. So this moment where Sign is facing this monster alone, it feels so much bigger than it would otherwise because of all the context that came before it. So Sign is facing this monster understanding that he won't be able to take it on his own, but if he wakes up Frieren without indicating to her that they can reflect some of her magic, it could cause drastic damage. He finds himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. An important part of Sign's story is how much he learned from Hyder, the priest of the previous hero's party. Growing up as a child, Hyder visited his town and spent some time teaching him and his brother. And one such lesson was that Hyder learned to take leaps of faith with Frieren, trusting her at her word. So for 5 seconds, he dispels the curse. And the scene is magnificent. A fight that should have been uninteresting instead is one I could make an entire video about. Because despite the generic plant monster or the lack of stakes in previous episodes, this scene is still just fantastic. And it's only half the episode.